good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Building a Carbon Neutral Dairy Industry. I'm Mark Salter. I'm the Executive Director for CFA Society Minnesota, and it's my job to get things started and then get out of the way very quickly. So the lovely folks you see on the screen right now are the folks who are going to be leading us through this topic. We've got Kent McClanahan, Susann Gibbons, Jennifer Schmitt, Nathaniel Springer, and Patrick Cheney, and we thank them all in advance for what I'm sure was going to be a wonderful conversation about this topic. Before I turn it over to them, Megan, can you move to the next slide, please? My job is to say thank you not only to the people who are going to be talking today, but also to the firms that you see on the screen here today. Our annual sponsors are awesome. We cannot do what we do throughout the year without their generous contributions of time, talent, and treasure. So we always like to take a moment and let them know how much we appreciate their support throughout the year. Last but not least, one more thank you. And that one goes to CFA Institute. A year or so ago, actually more than that, when the pandemic first hit, they reached out to our society and others and said, would it help you guys if we got you a Zoom meetings license? And we said, yes, please, thank you very much. And I always like to take time to thank them for thinking about us and making this happen. Without that support as well, I'm not sure how well we would have survived the pandemic and continue to deliver high quality educational programs like the one you're about to embark upon today. With that, I think I'm probably turning it over to my good friend, Susann Gibbons from the U. Susanna, I'm gonna mute, turn off my camera and let you guys have at it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm gonna try sharing my screen. Usually that's when things go badly awry, but here we go. Let's just see how this works. All right, someone give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Excellent. All right, so the project that we're going to be talking about is a collaboration that was funded by the Institute of the Environment, which is an interdisciplinary program at the University of Minnesota. IONE is not focused on your typical university research. They're really dedicated to having their knowledge build, transformative partnerships across the region and even across the world. One of IONE's current impact goals is building a carbon neutral Minnesota. And the idea for this project was actually hatched a little over a year ago, pre-COVID, when I met Nat Springer at Dunn Brothers in St. Paul to talk about, among other things, the article I had just read about, which was describing the GHG intensity of cheese. And for me, that was just devastating because I love cheese. So this whole project, everything we have done since then, is all about making it okay for me to have cheese. So I want to thank my partners on this project for their support in this effort. So shortly after meeting with Nat, we pulled in Jennifer Schmitt to help us with this project. And for the past year, and we've also partnered with WWF, or the World Wildlife Fund, and they actually have extensive partnerships in the dairy industry, and they've been collaborating with us on the dairy farmer side of this project. So for the past year, we've been really trying to build out a database of the economics of some of the GHG emission reduction technologies that we know are available. So today we are going to spend a few minutes talking about the current opportunity, some of the solutions that we have considered, how those solutions align with the evolving standards for green bonds. And then Nat and Patrick in particular are going to go through the economics of some of the GHG reduction strategies, which were developed, as I mentioned, at a really granular level. And then finally, Kent McClanahan has been kind enough to join us from RBC to lead us in some facilitated Q&A after we go through our slides. So I'm going to turn it over to Nat and he will get us started.
Susanna? Yeah, well, and I'm happy to indulge you in your reduction of your cheese footprint because, like you, I think cheese is the very top for me. I don't think I could live a dietary life without it. So one reason that we focused on dairy in general, and my colleague Jennifer and I have been doing some work in this area for the last couple of years, is for a couple of reasons. The first one, which is there's just a lot of emissions in the dairy sector. We generally think of impact of the energy sector, but as many of you I'm sure know, the recent development of companies like the Impossible Burger that are marketing themselves to try to reduce the footprint of a pound of beef, that goes for milk and cheese too. So it's agriculture is actually on par with the energy sector in terms of their impact, and dairy has a big impact, even compared to beef industry. One of the main reasons is because of there's two reasons mainly, and we'll get into that, but it's the burping of the cows, which is enteric fermentation, as well as manure. And then we'll look at some of the other impacts as well, which you can see here that, we have a fair amount of dairy in Minnesota here. And so we've mapped this at the county level, and you can see not only the greenhouse gas emissions on the left, but then we've for this project, what we're starting to look at is the potential revenue and net income you can get from investing in technologies to do something about this. And we presented this slide to dairy farmers, a group of dairy farmers in Minnesota about a couple of months ago. And this is how we're really trying to frame this problem. Dairy farmers in general have found it difficult to interact with folks who are really saying, well, you're a big problem here, you're emitting a lot of emissions. And really we're looking at this as an opportunity and a solution. I mean, this is really a hidden resource here that they have, is some low-hanging fruit in terms of emission reduction possibilities that folks are now getting paid for. And so that's really how we're thinking about this problem and how we got into it. And on the next slide, you can actually see a little bit more detail into those three types of emissions that I talked about. So you can see in some of the modeling that Jennifer and I have done, which is a kind of a commodity scale model at the sector scale, we've looked at the emissions that come from the inputs in the feed, as well as the on-farm emissions, and then like I said, the two big categories here, which are the enteric fermentation, or the burps that the cows have because they're ruminant animals, as well as the manure. You can see that the latter two really drive emissions in all these counties, and Stearns County the biggest, just because of course it has the most cows. And really, again, we're here still looking at, there's revenue within these categories that we're trying to get at as well. And that's kind of how we selected some technologies to start to think about, well, what would we invest in and how would we finance different portions of this greenhouse gas footprint. And again, another reason we really got into us, not only just from a pure impact perspective, but because people are asking for this. In particular, if you think about the entire greenhouse gas footprint of any entity, it's common now to divide this into the different scopes of emissions. And so, for instance, we have a company like Starbucks, which has recently made commitments to reduce its greenhouse gas impacts by half by 2030, and long-term to become net zero. So, they're, of course, can look at their scope 1 emissions like their factories, and scope 2 emissions like their energy use, but really their whole impact, at least particularly in the dairy sector, is in scope 3. The dairy farms themselves, and the production of milk at that level that ends up in all their products, and their half and half, and their coffees and their lattes and all that stuff. So without some sort of different mechanism, they can't decide to reduce those emissions on their stuff. They have to engage with the supply chain, they have to engage with sectors, and they've actually partnered up with the Dairy Management Institute and are working with them to do exactly the type of stuff that we're talking about now, which is like find solutions and then figure out ways to incentivize farms and to help them reduce these impacts in their scope 3 emissions. So we really got into the detail here. So, Jennifer and I, we're coming from kind of an economics and an engineering background. And so we're kind of thinking about this from, well, what are the specific things that we can do? What are the solutions or the technologies from a technical standpoint? And again, we've divided these up into 3 categories. that I've already discussed. And from the enteric fermentation or the EF side, a lot of the solutions have to do with feed. So what the cows eat, and what they eat reduces their burps. I know, Susanna, you referenced as like a gas X for cow. I guess it's like a burp X for cows, right? And what they eat does matter, and some of them reduce it to various degrees, and some are at different levels of research, but there's a lot of work going into that. Things like vaccines and feed additives, even direct capture, people are looking into. From an anaerobic or from a manure side, there's a number of different technologies out there to process manure and to reduce the emissions coming from that. And then as well from the farm and feed inputs, anything from energy use as well as fertilizer application, things like that. And we're going to focus on 3 technologies from each of these. The first one from the EF side is biochar. So that's something that cows can eat to reduce their emissions. And then the AD stands for anaerobic digester. So this is a technology that Patrick will go into a little bit more detail, but it processes the manure. And then solar as a very common one to reduce energy footprint. And so I'm going to just quickly go over the first one, the first technology here that we did kind of a deep dive into. And I should just quickly say too that this is ultimately leading up. What we wanted to do is kind of understand these technologies and then just kind of do a first pass economic and environmental return on investment to say, okay, what if we did this statewide? What would it look like? And so we dug into biochar, and one reason we actually looked at biochar because of one of our team members, you can see her down there on the right, Natalie Barca. She's an undergrad at the U. She's been working on this project with us for the past year. She lives and works on a dairy farm. She grew up on a dairy farm just outside of Litchfield, Minnesota, and you can see she's holding some biochar right there. They feed this to their cattle, and they feed it to their cattle not necessarily from just a greenhouse gas standpoint. Biochar actually is already known to be a feed additive that aids in digestion and potential productivity gains in the milk production. So it is being used, but it does reduce that fermentation on average between 10 and 17%. So a substantial amount, and often it's actually also used to store carbon in soil. So it's becoming a more common thing. There is a biochar market out there, but it's pretty nascent, and especially on the level where we would really want to see it have an impact. So the idea here would be that there's potential to invest in infrastructure or these larger biochar pyrolysis plants. And basically what they do is they take biomass. A lot of times it's byproducts from the forestry industry, or a lot of times if it's on a farm, it's the corn stover, the stuff that they don't use, and you can basically turn it into this kind of high carbon process, and it's then fed to cows. So this infrastructure exists, and we had some known costs and benefits from that. So we did that as our first technology to focus on. And I'm going to turn it over to Patrick now, and he's going to talk a little bit more about solar and then anaerobic digestion.
Thanks, Nat. So I'm going to talk about the two, call it infrastructure solutions, and kind of the low-hanging fruit here would be solar. I think everyone knows what solar is. What we like about it is that it's bondable because it's infrastructure. It's low maintenance. It's set it and forget it. Maybe not that easy, but it is low maintenance. Over the past 15 years, the cost to install and manage has come down quite a bit. Although over the last month, it's spiked up, but long term, it's become more affordable. It's obviously commercially available. It's competitive. It's a proven technology, and it's not. I mean, it's used in not just agriculture. It's used in other industries as well. And the way that we looked at this technology would be implementing it on dairy farms, either on the buildings on the top themselves or in the fields, as this picture shows. Can be used as shading for the cows. And so that's what we looked into on solar. Then we did a deep dive into anaerobic digesters. as Nat said, we refer to them as ADs. And an AD is infrastructure added to a dairy to take in manure and produce biogas that can be sold. The other piece of that is there's kind of this solid manure that's produced, which you can use to either spread on your fields for fertilizer, or you can use as bedding or sell for bedding. And then there's also effluent, which is basically liquid manure that you can run through your irrigation system to then spread on your fields for fertilizer as well. And again, it's infrastructure, so it's attractive for bonds. It generates revenue from 3 different sources. One being just the gas price, kind of the energy, D3 RINs, which is like a ethanol equivalent, and then LCF credits from California. And then as Nat had laid out, it is a big piece in reducing GHG emissions on farm. It's second to enteric fermentation. And so we focused on kind of commercially available technologies, proven technologies, ones that are currently in use on at least 10 US dairies. And so the best one we found is actually this picture here. It's the DVO linear vortex anaerobic digester. So that's what we focused on for our analysis. So when you're thinking about how to implement this, so first you have the anaerobic digester option of just a standalone. So you have an anaerobic digester that is put on site at the dairy. I mean, it is adjacent to all their other buildings, right? So you can see here, it's on a large dairy. Now, in order for this to work economically, it has to be a pretty large dairy, and it's got to at least have 1,000 head dairy or larger. But in Minnesota, there's not that many farms that have 1,000+ head dairy. More dairies are that 50 to 500 head. And so we did research kind of this hub and spoke model where you have a centrally located anaerobic digester that is then fed, right, manure brought to the anaerobic digester by large dairies, medium size, and small. Now this poses a lot of intricacies and problems in itself, because anytime you put manure on wheels, it does increase the cost. And so what you have to do is you have to be at the dairy, somehow get the manure into a truck it all the way to the anaerobic digester, then take that byproduct, like the effluent, that's fertilizer, and truck that back to the dairy. So it makes it a little more difficult to implement, but really to do this at large scale in states that, you know, that have smaller dairies, this would have more of an impact. And so an example, and I'm going to use an example of an anaerobic digester, but you could use other technologies. So in the upper left corner here, and this is a partnership with an investment partner and the dairy farmer. So what the investment partner would provide on an anaerobic digester that's on site, right? They would provide the capital for the infrastructure, repairs and maintenance of the AD, and the operational management of the AD. Because remember, you know, dairy farmers are good. Their core competency is producing milk. And, you know, if what we've seen is that dairies will implement these anaerobic digesters on site themselves, and within a year or two, it's obsolete. They're not even using it anymore because it's second fiddle to their main objective of producing milk. And so it's just another added operational piece that's not their core competency. So we'll put that on the investors' partner's shoulders, and then the investment partner will also have the wherewithal to market the various products as well. So as we move to the right, the farmer is going to provide land, whether it's purchased by the investment partner, or it's just rented. And typically the contract is about as long as the life of the anaerobic digester, say 15 to 20 years. There also needs to be a long-term manure contract, which is 15 to 20 years, because it doesn't work without that. Then if we go down on the lower right, investment partner receives the land to put up the anaerobic digester, receives the manure, and will receive the bulk of the revenue from the anaerobic digester. And again, that's the sale of the energy, right? The gas, the D3 RINs, which is like an ethanol equivalent, and the LCF credits from California. The farmer is going to receive rent for the land, effluent and solids back from the AD process to use as fertilizer. And anecdotally, we've talked to groups that have done this to incentivize the farmer and basically to align the farmer with the anaerobic digester investor. Is there is some profit sharing as well. And so this is one idea that we've seen implemented to lower GHG emissions, and that's all I have.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, and so, you know, that's a good example of how we're trying to connect these individual solutions with, you know, how they could be structured. And Susanna's gonna, after I finish here, she's gonna talk more about how we're thinking about this from a bonding perspective and from a financing perspective. But, you know, just getting back also to these technologies real quick, one reason we did this is we also wanted to say, okay, if we can kind of do a first pass assessment of what the costs and benefits of these things are, and then see where the cows are, and you know how much we could actually reduce statewide. You know, what is the size of the type of investment we're talking about, and does it make sense for these three technologies? And so that's what we did. We basically did cost benefit and calculated the net present value and return on investment for these things. And at the same time as we're doing the financials, we're thinking about the environmental return on investment, right? So we're thinking about, okay, so however much we're putting in or we're getting back, you know, how much are we actually reducing emissions? And so we're thinking about this metric kind of in parallel. And we did this for all three technologies individually. And I should highlight, since Patrick just kind of went really into good detail about, we've been thinking about, well, how do we do AD at kind of this big farm level, which is a known, and then the smaller level, which is the hub and spoke. This example only includes the those farms that are bigger than 1,000. So we're going to implement this hub and spoke idea as a way to kind of expand the potential investment here. But right now, this only includes that the 1,000 cow dairies and larger that haven't already invested in anaerobic digesters. I think there's 6 right now statewide in the state of Minnesota that have been built. And so this is the results that we got from our analysis, and we scaled this up using data from the USDA on cows that are out there per county, as well as distinguishing between small, medium, and large farms. And you can see what we get is we get a statewide investment of $1 billion for these three technologies. And you can see that each one of these has a positive return on investment, substantial ones for AD and biochar. Partly, I think, at least in the case of AD, we've talked about this some, and it'd be interesting to talk a little bit more about this. But it's partly, I think, because I mean, really, we've analyzed the perfect case, right? I mean, ADs have to be right next to the pipeline. Not all dairies are right next to the pipeline. There's potential additional pipeline transportation costs, things that we've tried to include, but depending on where it is, it might be higher. But really, and we could talk about this too, it's some of the greenhouse gas credits that are really driving this high return on investment. And it's just, there's definitely money to be made there. And then similar for biochar. The biochar scenario assumes a greenhouse gas purchase credit, but at the same time, one reason it's so high is because it's reducing enteric fermentation, and the return on enteric fermentation is pretty high because there's just a lot of it. And so you can see the total return on investment altogether is pretty great. And then the investment per greenhouse gas reduced. I mean, these tell different stories, right? So biochar, you get a lot more greenhouse gas return for your buck. but not as much profit. And so it flips when you get to AD, where you have to put in a lot more capital, but you get a lot more back. And I put this chart here at the bottom just to kind of get a sense of what we're talking about in terms of the reduction in each category, right? So we have three main categories. You can see the blue pies down there is the enteric fermentation. That's how much enteric fermentation contributes statewide in Minnesota. And the blue shade, the hatched blue, is the amount you get reduction by biochar. And similarly for manure, that's the chunk for emissions for manure in Minnesota. And the AD that we've modeled gets you that little pie, and it's about 4%. And again, one reason it's small is because you only have so many big dairies that actually can do it this way. So this is why we're thinking about this hub and spoke model, because there's a lot more manure emissions there to figure out how to capitalize and how to invest in. And finally, solar gets you reduces about 60% of your on-farm emissions. So it gets you it's a really good solution, but there's just not that many on-farm emissions. So this is just kind of show you what each solution can get you statewide, which is about 10% statewide, which I think is pretty good for just three solutions here. And then we just map this. So again, this is kind of a repeat of our first slide there, where you can see this is really, the reduction is again in these places where there's a lot of cows, but we're talking about a pretty substantial reduction and a pretty good return across the board in these counties where there's a lot of dairies. So I think, and this is where we start thinking about, well, if there's these potential returns, why aren't people jumping at the bit to do this, and how do we actually bring capital to this and make these types of projects bondable? And that's where Susann is going to kind of dig in here.
All right, there we go. Found the mute button. Before I pivot into the financing, I just have to point out one thing. This was, an error on our part for using this in some respects. I'm going back here a couple of slides. This is not a dairy cow. Okay, so for those of you who know, this is a heifer. It is not a dairy cow. That's one of the things I learned from partnering with the scientists. So just want to make sure that everybody is aware that is not a dairy cow. All right, so having described some of these technological solutions, along with their economics, we're going to pivot a little bit to the finance side of the equation as soon as I flip through all of these slides again, and I'm sure there was a better way to do this. Here we go. Okay, so, historically, farmers rely on just USDA loans and loans through their banks. And USDA loans are obviously an attractive source of financing, but the entire burden still falls on the farmer. And one of the things that we're particularly concerned about, and this does also align with some of the work we've done on looking at green bonds, is that there really needs to be fairness in terms of cost sharing between the farmer and all of the people who benefit from the reduction of GHG emissions. I mean, the GHG problem is just a classic negative externality, and it is just neither feasible nor reasonable to expect farmers to manage the impacts on their own. And so we started looking at green bonds as a way of perhaps facilitating some of the cost sharing that has been needed. And so this basically demonstrates the same point in a slightly different way. I actually love this chart, and this is a fantastic resource, this transformative investment in climate smart agriculture, which we've pulled some of this information from, does a really nice job of sort of mapping out financing flows to the agricultural community. And as you can see, most of the funds from institutional investors flowing through public equities and fixed income goes either to funds going into equity investments in the ag value chain companies. On the bond side, it's really going to the farm credit system. And so that's where all the money historically has come from. So we're looking at green bonds as maybe a different way to connect institutional investment capital with agricultural financing. So I probably don't have to tell this group about the dramatic growth in green bonds. I mean, this chart shows green bonds issued each year since 2011. And over the past few years, there's been just an explosion of both demand and issuance in the green bond sector. You know, investors globally are interested in investing in a way that aligns with their values. And so I'm sure that's why some of you are attending this presentation. So I don't really need to spend a ton of time on these numbers, but I really do find them extraordinary. I mean, like many of you, of course, I have been a little bit concerned about some of the standards underlying green bonds. The International Capital Markets Association has developed some standards to try to bring a little bit of order to this world. Europe is a little further along, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I think the main thing that investors, and especially institutional investors, are concerned with is understanding the impact that their dollars are actually having. So we'll turn to that issue a little bit later, but suffice to say that green bonds have a ton of potential to fund investments that truly do have significant impact. All right, so going back to our little farm and our little digester, we've been thinking about the role of green bonds. And right now, the substantial opportunity that Nat described really sits in a silo by itself, in large part because of the smaller scale of dairy farms, particularly in the state of Minnesota. In the technologies and the research have evolved, so everything that Nat has described and that Patrick described is quite possible, but they're sort of disconnected at this point. And then the piece in the middle, the ROIs that Nat described are extraordinary and driven in large part by some of the net zero pledges, in my opinion, but we've seen just a significant increase in the price of RINs and LCFs, which are the two main carbon credits that drive the economics of some of these solutions. And so we think that green bonds can actually play an important role in sort of connecting these three distinct silos. We also wanted to make sure in looking at any particular structure that that what we're doing aligns with the rules for green bonds as outlined in the EU taxonomy. And even though obviously that's for Europe and we're in the US, Europe is so much further along that we really think the rules outlined in the EU taxonomy are going to become the standards for most of the world. And so importantly, in those standards, the EU has created a classification system for sustainable assets, and there are 4 key elements that any project or bond rather needs to satisfy. So the first is the bond has to contribute substantially to at least one of the 6 taxonomy environmental objectives. And so in this case, it would be GHG emission reduction. The projects cannot cause significant harm to any other objectives. They have to comply with minimum social safeguards, and where applicable, the finance projects have to meet technical screening criteria, which are evolving. And so any project or any green bond has to start with a project description or description of multiple projects, and then include the methodology and process for impact reporting. During the allocation process, reporting is required in terms of how the funds that have been raised are being deployed. And once proceeds are fully allocated, the standards require a final allocation report and ongoing impact report. And I think a lot of the work that that INE has done and has spearheaded really aligns with the ability to report on the impacts of some of these strategies. The other thing that is extremely helpful from our standpoint is the technical annex to the EU taxonomy has recently been published, and the strategies, the agricultural practices that we've described all align with what has been published in the EU taxonomy. So the animal feeding, manure management, and energy use are 3 of the primary categories for reducing GHG emissions in agricultural production. So everything that we've outlined is both technically feasible and also appears, at least at first glance, to align nicely with the EU taxonomy. All right, so the last thing we're going to get to is just some description of potential structures. So for those of you who are hoping to come here today and actually buy a green bond, we don't have one. We've just got a couple of different ideas of how a green bond might be structured to take advantage of the GHG reduction opportunity on dairy farms. So the first is partnering with a municipality. And there's actually at least one that I'm aware of. This is a bond that was actually issued in 2018. I know it says 2021, but I'm a sloppy cutter and paster. So this bond was issued in 2018. It's a $61 million issue from Pinal County, Arizona, and it actually financed an AD linked to a dairy farm. So there is some a template out there for a single issuer from a municipality. There is also a lot of potential for corporate issuers, and as we've been thinking about it, primarily from supply chain issuers. I don't mean to imply that Land O'Lakes is getting ready to do a green bond, although we would love to see that happen. It is just one possibility, and Land O'Lakes has actually announced some partnerships recently intended to bring carbon credits to some of their farmers. And so they are definitely moving in that direction in terms of working with their supply chain. And then the final possibility that I considered, and honestly, I just considered this really today after sort of thinking through this problem. One of the significant issues, as we've outlined, is that a lot of the value and a lot of the return from these particular investments is coming from the tax credits around RINs and LCFs. So RINs are renewable energy credits or renewable investment credits tied to ethanol prices. And LCFs are credits that have been created in the state of California. And the price of these credits has risen at a pretty strong pace, mostly in this year. And that is driving a lot of the strong ROIs that we showed to you. And so I was trying to think about a structured product framework that would allow some part of the structure to absorb the potential volatility in the RINs and the LCFs. And, you know, these are, I guess, tricky at this point because they really aren't hedgeable. The markets haven't evolved to the point where you can, where there are forward markets that have developed. And so they really do introduce volatility into the capital structure. So I think a next step for us might be, you know, what we've shown you is just a single point model with prices as they are today. What would the return be? But I think the next step for us is to do some more modeling to show a number of different scenarios under a number of different forward price assumptions about where these credits might go. And once we have that, I think we'll be able to do a better job of making a recommendation in terms of sizing and structuring a structured product. One other thing to note on the structured product, we've had a few conversations with some private equity investors who have noted that they're not really interested in owning the projects themselves, but they have become expert at developing and managing them. And there's a number of the technical complexities around, first of all, the operational management, which Patrick described a little bit. You know, if you are not an expert in managing these operationally, you're not going to get the full benefit of the credits that might otherwise be available to you or the GHG emission reduction. And then there's also just an administrative process in terms of registering and being able to trade the credits that your projects generate. And so the private equity shops that we've talked with are not interested in the properties themselves, but they are interested in managing both the operations and the administration of these projects. And so that actually might pair really nicely with a structured product financing. All right, I think that might be our last slide. We've got sort of a wrap-up slide here. I mean, basically what we have worked on over the past few months is the initial statewide assessment, county by county, of the technologies that can be deployed and where they can be deployed. And we've come up with potential financial ROIs and explicit GHG ROIs, and they look really compelling so far, and we think they should be sufficient to attract capital to scale up any of the credits driven by the GHG reduction potential on individual farms. We've also done, well, I haven't done this part, but Nat, Patrick, and Jennifer have been really fantastic at sort of collecting data, state of the art research on some of the technical options, and they've developed frameworks to build and analyze some of these ROI scenarios. And so a lot of the sort of bottom up work has been done. One of the things that these tools can be used for, of course, is verification, which is going to be increasingly important going forward. And finally, at least so far, we've been able to tap into expertise from a growing network. So in addition to folks at the university, there have been investors across the state, scientists, bankers, and hopefully now, as Kent will maybe open us up for Q&A, we can benefit from some of the expertise of our audience. So Kent, I will turn it over to you, and then we'll see if we can answer any of these questions. And I'm gonna, I'll leave the slides up if that's okay, in case we wanna turn to any specific specific slides from some of your questions, or see if we've got a couple of appendix slides to address some of the questions that might come up. So Kent, over to you.
Fantastic. All right, great. Yeah, we can go a lot of different ways with this, so I'm sure we'll be bouncing around the deck as we go. But good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thank you for our presenters for going through this interesting presentation. I know I came up with a lot of questions as I watched you all present, so I'll start running through some questions, but if anyone on the line has any questions that they want to ask, feel free to use the raise your hand function. I've got the list of people up here, and I'll try and call on whoever gets their hand raised, or we can, if you want to just blurt it out, we can just blurt it out too. But I think, sometimes it works best if we just raise the hand, you can actually see who's asking the question. So while everybody kind of thinks about it, comes up with any questions they may have, or figures out how to raise their hand, I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the ROI. That's kind of one of the key elements of this project. Maybe let's talk a little bit about some of the assumptions that are under it, some of the volatility that maybe has gone on within the pricing and the RINs and the other credits. I know we've seen a pretty big spike in the last year. How much of the ROI is driven completely by the credit valuation, and how much have we kind of seen, and what are kind of expectations for things going forward?
Let's see. Do we want to go to the let's go to the LCF prices chart. So I can kind of demonstrate some of the volatility in the LCF prices. And then Nat or Patrick, I don't know if there's a slide you wanted to use to talk to some of the ROI calculations. And if you've got something else on your desk that you want to, if you want to show them the massive file.
Yeah, the Excel details. No, I think I can take a crack at that to start off with. And I think just a very quick summary, at least with the ADs, if you don't have the LCFS price, the ROI goes negative. Like you don't have and this is in our, this is without any sort of the volatility analysis. So to Susanna's point, we're still fairly, this is really the end of our kind of first pass ROI. We haven't done the sensitivity. We haven't done kind of the long-term pricing assumptions, even interest rate, discount rates, long-term variation, stuff like that. So I think for AD, the LCFS is really what makes it go. And it's interesting because AD is, again, one of the more expensive solutions. So it's happening in a lot of places because of that. For solar's not, so both solar and biochar, they're not priced by LCFS or the RINs. So solar has its own thing, right? It's actually the energy credits that give it its small positive ROI. But I think as most folks know, that's been becoming more and more economically incentive, positive as we go. For biochar is, I think, hard too, because it's the newest, the most nascent market, really. And prices are really high, at least for biochar right now, partly because it's a nascent market, and experts expect that to go down. And we have that modeled right now. So we have kind of the declining prices of that, but we also have been, our ROI is dependent on not an LCFS credit, but just a regular carbon credit. And we've actually used a very conservative but honest, like if you don't get an LCFS credit, which only applies to renewable fuels, there's not as many other markets to be able to tap into. So I think we assumed like a $20 carbon credit for biochar reductions in emissions, which I was actually surprised that we got a positive ROI with that small credit, which is interesting in itself. So I think to Susanna's point, we do need to look at the volatility. I think we need to kind of even dig into a little bit more where some of these markets are going. There are other nascent carbon markets besides California. I mean, being able to tap into this is a relatively new thing in itself. So this is going to obviously change in the next 5 to 10 years. So, so I think thinking about a range of ROI is something that we need to be able to present here, and we appreciate that. These are pretty incredible ROIs, but they are driven by this LCFS, at least in the AD case.
So Kent, would it also be helpful maybe to describe exactly what an LCF is?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that was my next follow-up question is let's talk a little bit about some of these credits and the markets that we're dealing with, because I know there's a lot going on there and it's developing fast. So maybe talk a little bit about the different markets that are going on there.
So Patrick, do you want to take that one? Otherwise I can make something up, but
I'll give you a quick overview on the LCFS. So and just to piggyback on what Nat said, when you're looking at an AD, 70% of the revenue is coming from the LCFS credit. So it really does not, the ROI, I believe, goes negative, right, Nat? If without the LCFS, yeah. Yep. So it really is driven by that. And so California, I think this is 2008, comes up with this LCF, which is designed to reduce GHG emissions in the transportation sector. And so what it does is why it's good for a dairy is because dairies are, they're bad players in the GHG emissions in their structure. They emit a lot of GHGs, right? And so the worse the dairy is, actually the better the project is. So you get this called this CI, which is a carbon intensity score. And like a dairy, I think they average like -250, which then gives you a lot more of the credit, where let's say you were doing something like, what's another example, like ethanol or something, or some other, like, or diesel, you're maybe at like a 5 or a 0, where a dairy's at like -250, and the worse you are as a dairy, the better, because your score goes lower and you get more money per credit as you implement your technology. And then but that's not, there's a third party that comes in and does their assessment of your carbon intensity score, and then as you implement the technology, you have to have yearly reports done by a third party to verify that you're actually reducing GHGs.
Interesting. No, that's thanks for kind of running through that. And I know there's a lot of talk about that space, so interesting to kind of cover it off. I do see we have a question here from Amir. Amir, go ahead and fire away.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Kent. I think I got my camera on here. So I actually have a couple of questions, but I'll start with what I think might be a more substantial one. So I just want to make sure that I have it clear with the GHG reduction slide. It sounds like a $1 billion investment across those 3 areas would result in a 10% reduction in GHG from dairy sources. So just want to clarify that that's, accurate. And then really, I'm curious, is there a limit on the amount of GHG reduction? Like, would a $2 billion investment, be able to generate 20% reduction, or what are some of the limitations there?
Yeah, I can take that one. Thanks, Samir. Yeah, so that's right. And it's that upfront investment of $1 billion in the Minnesota dairies across the state would result overall, because you're taking 3 technologies and you're reducing 3 parts of those 3 buckets, both the enteric fermentation, the manure, and the energy. And you're reducing 10% of your enteric fermentation, you're reducing 4% of your manure, and you're reducing 60% of your energy. And on average, that ends up being about 10% across the state. But to answer your question next, then no, it's not a simple scale up, and partly because, I mean, this is actually applying just these technologies across all dairies, right? So at that point, we've basically maximized these 3 technologies. So at least not the AD, because the AD only applies to those big dairies. So if we did a hub and spoke model where we're able to get at those lower dairies, which have a different ROI, and probably even maybe a different greenhouse gas reduction, then we'd be able to expand the percentage reduction. But I think one reason we're talking about multiple solutions, I mean, we focused on these 3, is you'd still then have to start chipping away at other solutions, right? And so ultimately, it's, you'd have to start looking at the other on-farm energy emissions. You have to, well, we've gotten 10% of our enteric fermentation, but how do we get the remaining 90%? What else can we invest in? So it's yes, you can put more money at it, but it's not going to be a linear extrapolation from this first 10%, if that makes sense.
Nat, can I jump in and make a
Please
second
do.
comment to that?
Yep.
So a couple of things about ag, not knowing everyone's background on the call, so I'm sorry if you're experts in the ag industry. But some of these things, one of the reasons you can't just add and add and add is that some of these don't go to zero. Like if we want milk, we have to feed the cows. We can't have zero inputs. We can become more efficient and we can get savings, but the path is not going to be linear to a zero in terms of some of like the feed. We could do that with on-farm energy use, with renewables. We can kind of get that to a net zero, but not all of these buckets, if you will, of emissions can go to net zero. The other thing I want to point out in general about ag, I've been doing work outside of dairy, also in the meat industries, and we see this time and time again, is there are not the large, big hit savings. It's achieving greenhouse gas reductions in ag is going to be summing up these often single digit, or if we're lucky, low double digit savings, and knitting those together. And that's actually one reason that we thought about this bonds project as a way to start to, how could the financing look at bundles of things? Because we can't just put in, replace all coal with all wind. I mean, even that doesn't work, but that's more simple than trying to make these savings in the ag industry. So thanks.
And one final example of that's wonderful, Jennifer, is thinking about like the feed inputs, right? We looked at biochar and that gets you 10%. But there's other feed additives that people are looking at. I mean, one that's been heavily researched in the last couple of years is seaweed. You feed seaweed to cattle. Some of the research coming out, you don't get a 10% reduction, you get an 80% reduction, which is insane. And but there's not enough seaweed to feed 3 of the dairy farms in Minnesota, much less the whole state. And that's so much of a nascent industry that I mean, there's a lot of potential for financing in that. But I point that out too, because then in that case, there's a trade-off, right? Like it's not like you can add that 80% to the 10%. There might, I mean, I don't think the work has been done to say, well, what happens if you feed seaweed and biochar at the same time? What is the interaction effect there? But it's definitely not going to get you to zero. It's going to get you closer. But that's the way we're thinking about these solutions is, as Jennifer said, layering, and really then ultimately looking at the trade-offs and what works where, because something might work here, but it's not going to work here. So okay, then what do we pick there? And we're trying to think about how we can optimize that, both in time but also in space.
Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot. That's super helpful to understand as someone who knows nothing about dairy farming. So I appreciate it. My second question, hopefully, is a quick one, but can you just put it into context? I kind of wish I knew these numbers already, but what's like the total greenhouse gas emission, in the ag sector compared to, I don't know, the energy or transportation sector in the state?
Ag in general, Is that?
Yeah, just like, what would be the equivalent of, is it like, taking however many million cars off the road, or like taking out one coal power plant, or?
That's a good question. Yeah, actually, yeah. So I think I mentioned, I think it's about, as a whole sector, the energy sector it's more, but it's comparable to ag. I think energy is first and ag is second. I don't know. I don't have the figures right in front of me, but I did look in, for instance, this the slide that we're on right here. So there's a reduction, basically for $1 billion in investment, you get an annual reduction in about, I think, a million tons of greenhouse gases per year, which is about 3 coal-fired power plants. So that's the level of investment we're talking about here, is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions by just basically shutting off 3 coal-fired power plants. So you're not hitting 1% yet, but I mean, this is only Minnesota, and this is only 3 technologies. So it's actually pretty substantial in terms of a comparison to the energy sector. But you're right. Yeah, it's sometimes. Yeah, I've been working with this stuff for a while, and I've never seen a ton of carbon, so I don't know what it looks like. Like, it's just hard to think about what that means.
I want to jump in here. I have the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency provides a greenhouse gas inventory that you can look at, and in there they talk about Minnesota specific emissions, and really transportation, electricity, and ag within what's called the ag, forestry, and land use bucket are all roughly around 40 million metric ton CO2 equivalent, right? Whatever that looks like. But just knowing that those buckets are pretty close to each other, the other buckets tend to be lower. So those are the 3 areas where, for instance, the state is really focused on finding emission reduction opportunities.
Great. Thanks for the questions, Amir. If anyone else does have any questions, feel free to raise your hands. One of the things I wanted to ask about on this page is for the 80, you've said it's modeling using the 1-for-1, where it's like on the farm, but using the hub and spoke model, does it require either a significantly larger investment in order to do the hub and spoke versus kind of the 1-for-1? And then also, are the benefits greater, right? Like, are you able, because it is kind of a centralized thing, are you able to maybe make a bigger 80 in order to take down more? Like, I'm just kind of curious, how is it different doing the hub and spoke versus doing just one large one?
So Ken, I can talk to the cost. So it is a substantial cost to move that manure, and we're still working on exactly what that is. So it's twofold. So one is, you're going to have to, get to the dairy and somehow get the manure inside the truck. Then you're going to have to truck it there. Then you're going to have to truck the effluent back, right? And then number 2 is, like, to scale this up is, it's a lot easier to work with one dairy, right? Let's work with this. Working with multiple dairies is difficult to get them all on board, because none of this works unless there's a long-term contract. And so we're still working through that. As far as having a bigger impact, I think we can have a bigger impact. I don't know if you can do like and Nat, maybe you can speak to this, like, just do this massive anaerobic digester. But I know what's been brought up is a combination of, let's say, working with the municipality to obtain food waste and other municipality waste in conjunction with gathering manure from dairies. And this was brought up when we had a call with dairy farmers, was, well, to make the economies of scale, you need to do this with the municipality to bring in, basically human waste and animal waste and food waste, to really make it work. So, but we're still working on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Patrick. Long story short, we just haven't done the analysis yet, which again is going to really depend on transport costs. And part of the problem too is we have data on county level, like amount of dairies and types of dairies, but we don't have as much data on point source of where these exact dairies are, which is, I think, central to figuring that out. But even though we're still going to try to do some sort of assessment of those transportation costs. And I think we talked about this, Susann and Patrick, a little bit. Is, I mean, the nice thing is, at least with that ROI, if it ends up, being driven that high by the LCF credits, that does give you quite a bit to work with. And I think your point about the bigger size, that's a great point, because it should get cheaper. And so we'll continue to look at that. And because as you can see, I mean, we only get 4% of that manure. So there is just a lot more there that we're missing because we're not hitting these small farms. So we definitely need to do that and want to do that, and hope to have that shortly.
The other piece of this that we haven't talked about, I mean, basically the reason we are able to generate credits from the state of California is because you're dropping renewable natural gas into a pipe. And so we've had some conversations with the utilities. Basically, you need to have some part of a pipeline extension, and that has to go through a regulatory process, and that also has a cost. And so part of the question is whether it costs more to build more pipe or to truck manure around. And so the hub and spoke model, we haven't really basically built out what that additional pipeline cost might look like, and sort of look at the trade-offs between that and driving manure around.
Yeah, so plenty of variability there, but it sounds like, as long as the prices stay where they are, it still could be viable. So
it feels like it should be. I mean, I do think that, over the long term, to the extent that the carbon credits are successful in bringing investment dollars in, I think the expectation should be that at some point the price of the credits declines, just based on demand. But at least right now, the numbers are just so enormous. I think there's a lot of room for both price declines and some of the additional costs, but we haven't modeled them yet.
Gotcha. Looks like we do have a question from Danelle. Maybe you want to articulate your question a little bit there, Danelle. Is this talking about from the green bond side of things?
Yeah, I was just wondering about verification costs. I worked on energy efficiency projects, and just having the third-party evaluator to verify, the reductions and that kind of thing drives the whole project to zero. So I'm just wondering if you included those.
I don't believe those are included in the O&M costs. Nat, do you know if we included those anywhere?
They're not for biochar, and I know some of the O&M assumptions we made were not that specific. So I actually don't know. We didn't have enough detail. One thing I can say to the verification, and we've talked a little bit about this, not just in bringing in the cost, but what that would mean. Because some of at least from an LCFS credit perspective, there's a verification process there as well. And some of the stuff that they use, there's definitely companies that come out, audit, and do these things. And these, the people out in California are doing this, and they're still making money. People here are doing this too, and they're starting to make money. But I guess my point is, yeah, there definitely are people doing that. So including those explicitly, to your point, I think is super important, especially for something like solar, where the ROI is right on the margin there. But I would also say that some of the work that I'm familiar with too, in this space, at least from a methane emission point of view, which addresses kind of both the AD and the biochar. The science isn't there yet, but auditing is really expensive, and there is a lot of work going on right now on remote sensing verification of some of this stuff, which part of the goal is, to your point, is to really bring down verification costs. Because sending people out there doing this is really expensive, and if you can do this from drones, from satellites, from airplanes, and from data in that way. It's just that the science is getting a lot better on that, where what seemed impossible 5 years ago is not. And that might actually be one way where the verification is going for some of that stuff that will bring it down. But that's just me being optimistic and fairly speculative. I think in all these cases, we should not be ignoring these verification costs by any means. And I just think we haven't been granular enough to piece that piece out and how that varies.
Great. Looks like we do have another question from Colin. Colin, go ahead.
In terms of the ROI on the ADs, how long are those farms been operating using the ADs? Are you guys looking at it in the course of, they're brand new, like a year, 2 years, or and the reason I'm asking that is just because of I know the maintenance and the upkeep on those can be very challenging and cost intensive. So I just was curious if your guys's ROI was on newer ADs on these farms, or 5-10 years, or if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, Colin. So we're basing our models off of like a brand new AD, so one that can handle 1,000 head dairy, and those O&M costs are about $350,000 a year.
Okay, thanks.
So they're large, yeah.
And when we talk to farmers, this was interesting too, Colin, because some of them had tried AD maybe 10, 20 years ago and were really turned off by it. Like, some of them didn't work very well, especially in Minnesota. I mean, technically, we have stories where it gets cold and, this stuff literally freezes. And, that's, this is the problem. I mean, with newer technologies, but it's not as new anymore. Like, these have been around. Actually, the oldest AD, I think, still in operation in Minnesota was 1999. So they have been around for a while. There's 6 now, 3 just came online this year. And I think that's why we're a little bit bullish on them, because they seem to be developed enough technology where some of these kinks have been worked out. And to Patrick's point of view, if they're big enough, then some of the management problems that you get at kind of the small scale, where you have the dairy farmer themselves going out and troubleshooting when that's not their expertise, right? Those are overcome, I think, at this scale.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you for that. That's interesting to hear. So one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about that we kind of went through was a little bit about the green bond process, and just kind of talking about kind of reporting out on the impact side of things. Is it just greenhouse gas emissions, or what other pieces would have to go into kind of reporting this out or creating a green bond if we were to use these as an underlying piece of a green bond and creating that?
So the reporting process, at least as I understand it so far, first of all, it's still evolving, and I expect there are more experts on this call than me around that. So if anybody knows different answers to this, I would love to benefit from your knowledge. But the reporting process, at least outlined by the EU taxonomy, and this is different from International Capital Markets Association, which I think is the standard that might be used in the US currently. But under the EU taxonomy, you first have to define both just the process and you have to first come up with a description of the projects and then define the process and methodology that you are going to use to measure the impacts going forward. So that's before the issuance of the bond. You were then required to report on the allocation. So once you raise the bond proceeds, as those proceeds are allocated to various different projects, you are required to report at least annually on where all of the money gets invested. And then the final piece of the reporting is on impact. And that, as I understand it, is also an ongoing requirement. So there's sort of 3 pieces to it. The first being prior to issuance, the second being reporting on allocation, and as you go along, and then the third being final allocation and impact.
Gotcha. So with this, would there kind of be 3 different measures? You know, if you did a biochar, solar, and AD, or would you kind of do one for each one? How would you kind of report the?
Yeah, you would, my expectation would be that you'd have to report on each one of them. And at least as I've read the taxonomy, it seems to contemplate that a bond issuance is going to result in multiple different projects, which is why there's, expected to be an ongoing allocation process. And so that's something that you would have to define in your methods section up front. And so my expectation would be there'd be a different process for defining the GHG emission reduction for each of the different technologies contemplated, whether it's these 3 or additional technologies.
Gotcha.
There are also standards that have been created that define basically the percentage of reduction, relative to your starting point. And so that's also part of the, I guess, the technical annex to the EU taxonomy. So in addition to the actual amount, we're also expected to look at the percentage reduction. So the work that Nat's already done is an important piece of what we are required to demonstrate. I say
Gotcha.
we in the, like
collective we.
Yes, exactly.
That's great. So you talked a little bit about like one current model that's running is that municipality one in Arizona. Is that the only one that you've seen that model, or is there other types of facilities either being discussed or in production today, or are there opportunities for this to kind of get licensed out, or just talk a little bit about some of the different facility types that you all have seen or heard other people talking about or think might work as a business model for actually getting these out into the market?
So the one that we mentioned, the Arizona project, that's the only single asset financing that I've come across. And part of why that works is obviously that particular dairy farm in that county is large enough. And in terms of other financing, I really haven't seen any financing that employs like the hub and spoke model that we've described. It's really been projects that have been developed on larger dairies. And I think as we've talked to farmers and sort of looked at the complexity, it really is the challenge of both getting all of the contracts in place that you would need to get in place to make the hub and spoke model work, the additional cost and hassle factor of driving manure around. I mean, there's a lot of structural impediments to making that a reality. So I'm not aware of any place where that's actually been deployed. Patrick, I don't know if you came across that in any of your research where it's actually been deployed effectively.
So there's one hub and spoke that I've heard of, and it was ran by like a committee of farmers, and so that has in itself its own problems. Like the groups we talk to who are actually investing in this and managing it. I mean, they hire engineers, they hire someone on site, then they might have a specified engineer for each site, and then their expertise in actually marketing the RINs, the gas, the LCFs. There's a lot to it. So.
And I can say also that, we focused on one specific, type of digester and approach, which is, a digester to produce renewable gas, partly because of the LCFS credits. And we know that that's kind of a burgeoning way to make these things profitable. But there's lots of other types. I mean, as I think Colin mentioned, this has been around for a little while. And there's a lot of different reasons you might do it. A lot of other ways you might use the biogas, whether it's a co-digestion or not, So I'm actually in the chat. I'm going to put a link if folks are really interested in AD. The EPA actually manages a list of livestock anaerobic digesters across the country. And this is where you can see that Minnesota has 6 of them and where they are but it looks like there's almost 300 across the country. And there's just lots of different ways to do this. So I think that's just something to keep in mind as well here in terms of the financing. And, again, outside of, we're really focusing specifically on dairy too. So there's lots of other reasons you might want to build an anaerobic digester, such as we've talked about food waste and things like that. So
Interesting. Very cool. Thanks for sharing the link. I'll check it out. So I know, let's say an investor came to you and said, how would you structure something like this? Like how would you actually want to get this into the market and get going? What would your ideal structure be as you try and bring this forward? I know there's a lot of other structures that are used to get other renewable technologies or renewable energy projects off the ground. So if someone came to you and said, all right, I'm interested in doing it, how do you want to try and set it up? What would be your approach? Is there a model out there that you would want to follow, something that you think is in the market that is that you think would want to try and emulate?
All right, so I've only spent basically today thinking about the structured product model. So it's sort of my favorite thing to du jour. Basically my example of how finance can be used for good as well as evil, right? And so, and the reason why I guess I'm kind of focused on this is because of the ability to sort of tranche out the cash flows into different risk buckets. It doesn't remove any of the administrative complexity. In fact, it probably adds a layer. It adds a couple of layers of administrative complexity in terms of getting the farmers on board, getting the operation and management of the plant itself and all of the credits that go along with it on board. But I think from a structural standpoint, the ability to tranche out the different risk levels is really nice. The issue that just keeps coming up in conversations with people is nobody actually wants to own the anaerobic digester. Nobody wants to own this, right? It's a viable technology. It generates significant emission reduction. It generates strong ROIs, but there doesn't seem to be a natural owner of the plant. And so that tells me that maybe a structured product solution would be something to consider. I'll probably change my mind by tomorrow.
That's very interesting. What kind of incentive would you think would need to be added to it in order to get somebody to want to hold it? Would it need like a government subsidy, kind of like some of the things had, or would it require, maybe they get to hold most of the RINs? I don't know. What would you think would be the incentive to actually have somebody want to hold it?
To hold the digester itself.
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, the problem is they would be located sort of dispersed across the county, right? So there's not, it's not like there's a single location where they could exist. This is a distributed piece of infrastructure. And so, I mean, it could be that the utility model for solar would be a reasonable one. I mean, I feel like a utility might have both the scale and the ability to develop a partnership that could hold these assets across multiple locations, because that's how they finance a lot of the wind assets that they own. So utility might be one option for that. It's also sort of in their energy space. And so they already know how to do it. So that might be one place to look.
Is this renewable gas usable to power a natural gas power plant? Like, just kind of thinking along those lines, is that gas usable in a natural gas power plant?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, that's one of the things that makes the AD expensive is that the gas has to be cleaned before it can be dropped into a pipe. So once it's dropped into a pipe, it's fungible with all of the other gas that's in the pipe. But the processing of the gas is one of the expensive parts of the AD.
Interesting. Yeah. So maybe there is something to the utility model there.
We did have a couple of conversations with utilities, and it's certainly something that they have talked about. It's not anything that they are doing currently. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the issues was everything they do is, at least in the regulated entity, has to be approved by the regulator. They had been having conversations about creating, adding additional pipeline to facilitate renewable natural gas, and that wasn't approved by the state regulators. So the regulatory process at the utility would be probably a pretty lengthy one, and we haven't really tapped into that expertise and what would be required there. We just know that it's a problem.
Gotcha. Well, I know we're kind of coming to the bottom of the hour here, so if anybody has any other questions, definitely feel free to fire away. But if not, I think I kind of want to just leave it with what's kind of keeping y'all from being able to actually do it? What is kind of your key need? What can the people on the phone do to actually help get this moving in the right direction? What is, it's obviously you got a large group of people that are interested in this. So what can the people that are on the line do to actually help move this down the field?
So I think we really need an investment banker. Again, things that can be used for good or evil, but I really think having a banker is one of the ways that you can bring all of these different parties to the table. You need to have someone whose job it is to help negotiate all of contracts with all of these different parties. So I think a banker would be extremely helpful. I know that's so. Not too many times I've wished for an investment banker, but I think that's one of one of the things that will help this market evolve is investment bankers who really start to focus on the development of green projects.
Would they be the one then out negotiating with the farmers, or is that how is that interaction working?
Maybe Jennifer is like, oh my God, no, don't.
Meeting of the minds right there, right?
I don't think that would work. There might, that may be, one of the things that our partners at WWF, they have relationships with farmers, and that might be a better party to participate in that. Jennifer, what do you think?
Well, yeah, the people on this call, I think your call for an investment banker makes sense, but I felt like it was oversimplifying things. We did have a call with some farmers in Minnesota to learn about their perspective, and they're not a monolith either. And in order to get a project going, it's like we need an investment banker who has a translator, who also has a connector along the entire kind of value chain of this, to hold pieces together, as well as like community advocates in the farming community to bring people to the table. I think that's why it's actually difficult, is there's all these different moving pieces that also don't talk to each other, that need to get on board to kind of make this happen. And I know that's not a simple, beautiful answer, and I'm sorry for that, but I think that's why we've, in this year, just kind of sat with it quite a bit of like, okay, let's move this a little bit and let's understand this a little bit. And there's just,
honestly,
parts.
One of the really interesting things about this project, I know this isn't the question you asked, but I'm going to answer the question I feel like answering, which is the just working with Jennifer and Nat and their team has been just so interesting, because we come from such different worlds, right? I spent most of my career before the U, managing institutional portfolios. And so when we started to talk about like what was a big number, it's like, no, $10 million is not a big number. Like if we want to attract institutional dollars, we need a big number. So I was really excited today when Nat came up with his $1 billion. Like, okay, $1 billion is something we can sink our teeth into. But there's just been a lot of, circumstances like that over the past year where we're coming from really different worlds. And so just trying to get these two worlds to be able to communicate, to develop a solution that kind of works across the worlds has been a fun part of the experiment.
That's great. I think that's a good call to action. So if anyone on the line knows a investment banker who speaks farmer, please be sure to make the introduction. And I think it could be a really interesting thing to try and bring these groups together, because it is a big need. This is an area that we often hear all about renewable energy, but I think, hearing from that, how big the actual impact ag has, this is probably one of the areas that's going to need to actually be addressed if we want to try and meet the 2-degree reduction by 2050. So thank you all for the work that you're doing in this space. I know it is a big need, and I'm sure eventually somewhere along the line, someone will figure it out. So, and it'll probably be built on a lot of the work you all have done. So thank you for your time and going through that.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for having us,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I have never heard a better explanation, an investment banker who can speak farmer. That was an awesome closing statement. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for digging into this topic with us, and look forward to more in the near future. So take care.
Great. Thanks, everyone.